How you doing?
I was doing really good till I watched that.
I was going to say happy first Saturday of the fall. First Saturday of the fall. How you doing? Not any better? I chose that clip because I want it to be something that we take away, to set us up for something we're going to want you to take away. And so I know it's a hard clip to watch, but I know it's a hard clip to watch, but I think it will prepare us for, I think, what will be really important that we walk away with today. Well, as we continue in our study, What on Earth is God Doing? We've just been talking about, we've been really going through the whole Bible. We're in the Old Testament now, and we're going to be in the New Testament next time. But one of the things that we've said is that when it comes to reading the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, there are certain key themes and events in both Testaments that God wants us to notice and to connect together. Now, why does he want us to do this? Well, because when we connect those key themes and events from Genesis to Revelation, they form a single, cohesive, united story, a unified story. And that story is about a couple things. Number one, who God is and who we are. It's about why the world is the way it is, how the world came to be and why it is the way it is. And it's about also what God has been doing in our world amongst us since the beginning of time. Now, what we've come to call this is God's story. God's story, remember we said, is really the essence of reality. If you want to know what reality is, understand God's story. Someone once said that pain is what you feel when you bump into reality. Another way to put it is pain is what we feel when we live counter to God's story. Why? Because God's story takes all of life and all of humanity and it moves it in a certain direction. And when we go in the opposite direction, that's when we feel pain. That's when we feel the frustrations of life. But it is not only the essence of reality. One of the things that we've also been seeing is that God's story is the framework for our story, for your story, for my story. Now, last time we suggested that God is not just telling a story, but that he is telling what kind of a story? A war story. A war story that is supernatural in origin. In other words, it's not just between a couple nations here on earth or people or different soldiers. It is cosmic in nature. It is cosmic in scope. It involves the seen and unseen realms all working together. And it is determinative in nature. And by that, what we mean is whatever happens in this war is going to determine what happens in your life, in my life, in every person's life, and eventually in the whole world. It's determinative in nature. Now, as such, it's the energy that's driving the human story. In other words, as human history is moving forward, what's driving it is this war between the seen and unseen realms. It's also the context for the gospel story. We'll begin to see this next time, but we really can't understand what the gospel is and what Jesus came to do and why he did the way he did, apart from understanding God's story as a war story. And thirdly, like I said, it's the framework for your story. Now, what do I mean as the framework for your story and my story? As a framework, God's story grounds your story in reality. It keeps us moving in the right direction. How so? Well, reality as a follower of Jesus is that God has rescued you from the domain or the rule of darkness, Colossians 1 says, by delivering you into the kingdom of his dear Son. So he's taking you and me as we put our faith in Christ, who were oppressed and enslaved in the kingdom of darkness. And through our faith in Christ and through the work of Christ, he's rescued us and he's delivered us and he's brought us into his kingdom. But not only that, he didn't just make us members of the kingdom. We see in Galatians 4 that God has adopted us into his family as his beloved son. We're not just brought out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his son, but now in the kingdom, we are made special. We are brought into his divine family, and we are now called the sons of God. Now, God has tasked us, thirdly, God has tasked us as sons, remember we saw last time, to participate with Jesus in our Father's business. John 14 and 15, 16, all of that is talking about how the Father is working, the Son is working, and how we as his disciples are to be doing what the Father and the Son and the Spirit leads us to do. We're to be about our Father's business, just as Jesus was about his Father's business. Why? Because we are sons. Now, this framework that we've been rescued, we've been adopted, and we've been tasked gives your story a framework. And here's your framework. The story gives us a framework of hope. We have a good future. We've not just been brought out of the kingdom of darkness, delivered from enslavement to sin, but we've been placed in a good place. There's a new creation coming, and that is our hope. That is what's coming. We are going to be part of that. Listen to what's going on in our culture today. They're looking for utopia. They're looking for some kind of a perfect, just environment, but it's not going to come. Our culture today doesn't have hope. It's fearful and it's desperate, and they're clawing and grasping, trying to find hope. God's story anchors your story in reality by giving you hope of a good future. Second, it gives us identity. All of what's going on today with the gender ideology and everything we see happening today is all about looking for identity. I don't know who I am. What we see here is that we have an identity. We don't have to guess who we are. We are the sons of God. We have identity. But thirdly, we have direction. You know, again, you look at our culture today, you look at the world today that is looking for a purpose, looking for meaning. And so they're trying to create things out of nothing. Rather than seeing outside themselves, they're looking inside themselves in order to create a sense of purpose and meaning. But there is none. There's only purpose and meaning found in the story of God, because God is the author of that story, and God alone gives purpose and meaning. And so we find direction in doing what? The Father's business. So God's story grounds your story in reality by giving us hope, identity, and direction. But what is the Father's business, you say? Well, we saw last time again that presently the Father's business is cosmic war. He's making war in order to do one thing: to restore the nations of the world back to himself. To take those who have wandered far off from him and restore them to him as his human family. And in this cosmic war, Genesis 3:15 tells us that it is a war against God and his family, and the serpent and his family, or his followers. And as God's sons in this cosmic war, doing our Father's business, we are to function, Paul says in 2 Timothy 2, as good soldiers, fully focused and committed to the battle, even to the point of suffering and bleeding. We are to be good soldiers in this battle. Why? because we are God's sons, called and tasked to do the Father's business. Which means, as good soldiers, we are not to be that guy. Who is that guy? Well, that guy is a failed soldier who faltered in battle. Now, he probably didn't want to be a failed soldier. I mean, as you watch, he's just tortured. He's wanting to move forward, but he can't out of fear, and he's just paralyzed. He wanted to be a good soldier, but he wasn't. He was a failed soldier who faltered in battle. And you look at that, and tragically, if you really think, if we are soldiers in this unseen battle going on all around us, I fear that this describes failed soldiers who falter in battle, too many of us as Christian men. What do you think? True? How so? Well, we are failed soldiers who falter in battle, but we don't have to be. We can be good soldiers who fight the good fight. But instead, when it comes to the cosmic war, too many of us are unaware of the reality that there is a battle going on. We know that we're sinners and that Jesus died for our sin and we need to trust him so we can go to heaven when we die. And we think that's all there is to the Christian life as Christian men. And now you just be a good man, serve in the church, and keep your nose clean. We don't realize there's a battle going on all around us. Not only that, we are unclear as to what the battle really is about. Well, okay, yeah, there is a battle because I know it says we battle not against flesh and blood, but that's what missionaries deal with those demons and dealing with all that spirit stuff. So we're unclear as what the battle is. We'll be a failed soldier when we are uncertain as to how the battle is to be fought. There are ways to fight the battle and there are ways not to fight the battle. And yet so often we're not even aware of the battle to be fought, but when we understand the battle, when we have a clue that there is a battle, we don't know what to do. Do we become, involved in politics? Do we become involved in standing on street corners and preaching? What do we do? How do we battle? And then lastly, I think when it comes to the cosmic war, too many of us are underdeveloped in what the battle requires. And we've been seeing this ever since we began this series, and that is a heart of believing loyalty. That's what God longs from you, and it's that heart of believing loyalty that enables us to fight the battle, to persevere in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of the fear, in the midst of the uncertainty. And so we're unaware, we're unclear, we're uncertain, we're underdeveloped. And when that describes you and me, what we will do is we will falter in battle by default. Not because we want to. The spirit may be willing, but guess what? Our flesh, our level of spiritual maturity is weak. Guys, to fight the battle, we have to be serious about Jesus. We have to be serious about who we've been called to be and where we've been taken from and what he has tasked us to do. It's so much more than just waiting to go to heaven when you die and keeping your nose clean as we wait. And because of that, the purpose of our series is to help us as God's sons become good soldiers in the cosmic war by helping us become aware of the battle, by clarifying for you and me what that battle really is, by informing us how to fight the battle, and by helping us develop what we all really need and God desires in us is a heart of believing loyalty. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to begin to continue to unfold the story of God. And we're doing that because when we unfold the story of God, we create the framework for your story on which you understand who you are and how to live in a greater story that you're a part of, that at its nature is a war story. Okay? So let's review this cosmic war story. The story of God is about human history, where God has been working in the world and where the world and humanity has been going. It began in Genesis 1 and 2 in Eden, which we saw was the place where heaven and earth met. It was God's home on earth, and it was his throne. It's where he lived, and it's where he ruled. And God, we saw in Genesis 1 and 2, creates people, not because he was lonely, not because he needed help, for one reason, because God wants a human family. Remember, we saw he had an angelic family, but God wants another kind of a family, a human family, one that's more than spirit, one that is both spirit and material. So God makes man and woman. And then we saw that God asked that man and woman to serve him, to follow him, to go out into the world. And as they go out into the world, what happens? They are met by the serpent, and we see there is an uprising, the fall. In the fall, man and woman decide to not trust God, but to trust themselves. And if that wasn't bad enough, things go on in Genesis 6, and there is another uprising. An uprising that brought about the flood that involved the sons of God, the angelic sons of God, and the human daughters of man. And they came together and they produced the Nephilim. And if that wasn't bad enough, you go to chapter 11 and we see there is a third uprising. And that third uprising has to do with the whole world. They gather together to build this tower, not to God, but to create an idolatrous system that was to show and to make a great name for themselves. And what we saw is that these three cosmic uprisings, with them, death and alienation enter into the world. Depravity and evil are accelerated in the world. Again, so much so that in Genesis 6, God says, I've had enough, and he brings the flood. And idolatry and narcissism enter the world. And this is all the prelude to God's story. This is setting up for what God is now going to do. And so we saw when we come to the end of chapter 11, God has had enough. And so what he does in chapter 11 at the Tower of Babel, he divides his family into various nations. He scatters them across the world and divides them into nations, and then he divorces them. They will no longer be under his direct care. But because he still loves humanity, he doesn't just leave them as orphans. What he does is he assigns angelic sons to rule the nations on his behalf. Deuteronomy 32. But remember, we saw that what happens is that these angelic sons, instead of ruling on God's behalf, they rebel against God, and they begin to demand worship from the nations, and they then become the nations' gods. And so what does God do? God says, well, I am going to create a new nation for myself. Not one of these nations that I've divorced, but I'm going to create a new nation, and this new nation will be my rescue plan for the other nations. In other words, I am going to someday bring these nations all back to me because I love people. But how I'm going to do it is by creating another nation. And what nation is that? Israel. And I will use that nation to restore all the nations of the earth back to me. That was God's plan. And so God calls, he looks out over the world and he sees one little guy scattered amongst all the nations. by the name of Abram. His wife Sarah, he was old and they had no children, and she was barren. And God calls him in chapter 12 through 17, and he says this, Abram, I am going to make a great name for you. The people at the Tower of Babel, they were trying to make a great name for themselves. I'm going to make it a great name for you. And not only that, out of that great name, I am going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you lots of descendants, as many as the stars in the sky, the sand in the sea. And you're going to need a place for your nation to exist. And so I am going to give you a land that you're going to have to travel to, but it will be a land flowing with milk and honey. And I will give that land to you. It's populated by the nation, some of the different nations now, but I am going to give that to you. Why? Because it's mine to give. The earth is mine. But here's the thing I want you to see. He says to Abraham, and Abram, you will be, as a nation and as a people, a blessing. A blessing to who? To the rest of the nations. For it's out of Israel, out of Abram and his family in the nation of Israel, that God will call his people, the world, the nations, the divorced nations, back to himself. And so in chapter 18 through 15 of Genesis, we have Israel's beginnings. And we're given the different stories of Abraham's children, Isaac. Then Isaac has Jacob, who becomes Israel. Israel, or Jacob, has 12 sons. One of those, number 11, being who? Joseph. And you know the story of Joseph, how he's sold by his brothers. He's brought off to Egypt. And it's there in Egypt that he becomes ruler under Pharaoh. And because of the drought in the land of Canaan, which was the land that God had promised Israel, God brings the nation of Israel to Egypt in order for it to survive where there was food. And they are there for 400 years. And as Joseph was still in power, everything was good. And they were flourishing, and they grew, and they became a great people there. But what happened? Pharaoh saw there's a problem coming here. They are going to take over the nation of Egypt. And so he begins a genocide. What does he do? The death of every firstborn boy. God says, enough. And so God then brings about the Exodus. The Exodus event in chapters 1 through 17 of Exodus. And in this Exodus, remember we saw the 10 plagues. Pharaoh won't let them go, but he finally lets them go with the last one, the death of the firstborn. But we saw that it wasn't just 10 random plagues, that God was fighting and defeating the gods of Egypt, who were these sons that rebelled against him and became the nation's gods. Egypt had their own gods, these angelic rebellious sons, and God defeats them in a battle between the gods and the nations. And he not only defeats them, and he rescues them, and he delivers them, and he sends them on a road trip back to Canaan. But he didn't send them alone without something he wanted them to take away, and that was this. There was a lesson from the Exodus that he wanted his people, Israel, to learn and to always remember, to never forget. So much so that it became part of the Passover story. The Passover story is all about the Exodus story. And what was that story? What was the lesson? The lesson was this, that the Most High God, who fights and wins for you, can be trusted with your good. That's the message that God wanted his people to know and to never forget. That the Most High God will fight for you and he will win for you so that you can trust him with your good. The road trip is, we saw then, took a detour to Mount Sinai, Exodus through Deuteronomy. And there we saw that God enters into a covenant with his people. They really become part of his family in this covenant. And through the covenant, he gives them certain laws. And these laws are to act as a guardrail to keep Israel fit for his plan. If you are going to be part of my family and you are going to be part of my plan to draw the nations back to myself, you have to be qualified and fit for the plan. And that's what the law did. And so he gives them the law. They arrive at the land of Canaan. We learn about that in Deuteronomy and Joshua. And they arrive in the land, and the purpose there is to conquer the land, to establish a beachhead from which they will then go out to accomplish God's plan of rescuing the nations. That was the purpose of being in the land. Now, God gave them orders. When you get to the land, you're to do three things. Number one, you're to drive out all the nations that are there. Secondly, you are to destroy the gods' altars, the nation's gods' altars. And thirdly, you are to kill the Nephilim. There were still Nephilim that somehow survived from the flood from Genesis 6. But they're there. And so those were the orders. Drive out the nations, destroy the gods' altars, and kill the Nephilim. What happens? They get to the border of the land, and the first thing they see, they send out 12 spies, and what do the spies see? The Nephilim, the giants in the land, and they trigger, Deuteronomy 32 says, unbelief and disloyalty in the hearts of the people. God wanted them to remember that you can trust me with your good. Remember the Exodus. They forgot the story and they see the giants and their hearts melt and they're filled with unbelief and disloyalty. And so what happens? This unbelief and disloyalty prompts 40 years of wilderness wandering, Psalm 82 says. In other words, instead of going into the land, they take another detour around the Middle East there in the wilderness, waiting for that generation that saw the Exodus, God defeat the gods in Egypt, waiting for them to die out. And so after 40 years, Joshua now leads a new generation to conquer the land, Deuteronomy 32. And this generation has learned believing loyalty as they had to learn to trust God in the wilderness. And so they're ready for the fight. And they go in and they take most of Canaan and they kill most of the Nephilim. Some of them are left over that they didn't get to. And we ended last time saying, okay, will Israel finally become a nation of believing loyalty that is able to fulfill God's plan for them of being a light to the nations, that they can rescue, that God can use them to rescue the nations, to draw all of humanity back to himself. That's God's desire, to have a family. He's divorced human family from himself. He creates a new family. And that new family was to reflect God, to be a light, God's light to the divorced nations in order to draw them back to God. And will Israel be that nation? That's our question. Well, what we're going to see, really the answer is found in the remainder of the Old Testament, which we're going to look at today, Judges through Malachi. And it's interesting, as I thought about this, Judges through Malachi make up more than half of our entire Bible. And yet so often we really don't know what's going on. It's just a bunch of stories, a bunch of events, a bunch of dots. And we really don't know how to connect those dots to form a unified whole. So we're going to work at that today. And what we're going to see is that it's the story of Israel's successes and failures in the context of the cosmic war. That's what we're going to see. Now, today's purpose is to continue to unfold the cosmic war story by connecting these two final dots. We're going to take all of that section that I just described, and we're going to put them into two categories, two headings, two dots, and we're going to connect them with the dots that we've already connected. And the two dots are the period of the Judges, which is the story of Israel settling into the land of Canaan. And this is told in the book of Judges. This is a 450-year period. And then we're going to look at the second dot is the time of the monarchy, the time when the kings came on the scene. And this is the story of Israel not settling the land, but living in the land of Canaan. And this is told in the books of 1 Samuel all the way through Malachi. All the prophets are all about talking to the kings and to the people while they're in the land, living in the land. And what I want you to see is that the period of the Judges is about settling the land. The time of the monarchy is about living in the land. Why is the land so important? In fact, why is it even so important today to Israel? It's always been important to Israel. Well, in God's plan, the land is to be Israel's Eden. What was Eden? Eden was the place where heaven and earth came together. It was the place where God ruled. It was the place where God lived. And what we're going to see is the land of Israel, with Jerusalem ultimately at the center, where the temple is, where heaven and earth meet, is the place where God rules. It's the place where God lives. And it's from that place Israel is to go out unto the nations. In fact, in Acts chapter 2, after the Spirit came, what were we told to do as followers of Jesus? To go out. Where? From Jerusalem to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world. Where are the nations ultimately going to return? To Jerusalem. Why? Because that's the home and throne of God. That's where it will be someday again. And so what we're going to see today is, instead of exhibiting believing loyalty to Yahweh in the cosmic war against the serpent and his family, Israel is going to ultimately decide that we can exist without Yahweh, without God. And not only that, we can coexist with the nations and their gods. That's what we're going to see. And as a result, what we're also going to see is Israel in the battle is going to be a failed soldier who what? Falters. Israel is going to become like the nations. They're no longer going to be distinct. Israel is going to fail to be a light to the nations. They're no longer going to be a blessing. And Israel ultimately is going to be scattered into the nations. And they're no longer going to be in the land. That's what we're going to see today. So our question, how could this happen to God's soldier sons, Israel, who were delivered by the mighty power of God in Egypt? I mean, they saw all that. Wouldn't you think that would kind of impact you? Yeah, we can really trust God and we're going to be loyal to him. Or they were partakers of the special covenant at Sinai. They entered into a special relationship with God unlike any of the other nations. Or they tasted of God's Edenic blessings in Canaan. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. All of this, and they still are failed soldiers who falter in the battle. They exist without God, and they believe they can coexist with the nations and their gods. How does that happen? Well, the answer, Israel's believing loyalty slowly disappears in a downward spiral during the time of the Exodus through the conquest. it's just beginning to diminish and diminish and diminish. But when we get to the period of the Judges, Israel's unbelief and disloyalty take root. Believing loyalty is gone, and unbelief and disloyalty is the foundation on which their framework of their story is functioning. And so the question is, what is this period of the Judges? Well, the period of the Judges, as I said, is a 450-year period. After Joshua's conquest, he conquers the land, in which Israel was to do three things. So the land is conquered. Now the period of the Judges begins. And they're to do three things. First, they were to clear the land of lingering enemies. In other words, it was a mop-up operation. The war was over, the battle was won, and now we just got to do the mop-up. They were to divide the land by the 12 tribes, and then they were to, as they divided into the 12 tribes, which were their inheritance, and then they were to make it their home. Thirdly, as they made it their home, they were then to fulfill the purpose. They were not just there to have a nice life. They were there in the land to go out and fulfill God's plan, and that's bringing the nations back to God. So that was their purpose. But instead, what does Israel do? If you read Judges 1 and 2, it gives us a summary of the whole period of the Judges. And what it says is this: Israel failed to clear the land of the remaining nations and their gods. Instead, they chose to make their home in the land amongst the nations and amongst their gods. And as a result, it says two things in Judges 1 and 2. The nations became a thorn in Israel's side. And by that it means that they oppressed Israel and they enslaved Israel similarly to the way Egypt did. And then secondly, it says that the nation's God became a temptation to Israel's heart. In other words, Israel was filled with idolatry and apostasy. And what I want you to see is this Judges 1 and 2, the summary of what happened in that period, shows us that this is where unbelief and disloyalty to Yahweh took root in the nation of Israel during the period of the Judges. Now, Judges gives us the process in which this happened. And it's an interesting process. Judges chapter 4, verse 4 through 21, describes this a 400-year repeating pattern. It begins with rebellion. All these start with an R. It begins with a rebellion. And the rebellion is this: Israel worships the lesser gods of the remaining nations. They turn from the Most High God and they serve and worship the lesser gods of the nations. So what happens? Well, there's retribution. What does God do? God allows the remaining nations to oppress Israel. In fact, over and over he says he sold them into this nation's hand. When they did this, he sold them into that nation's hand. The idea is he sold them into slavery, similar to what happened in Egypt. What happens? Well, repentance. Israel cries out to God for help. Again, in a very similar way that happened where? In Egypt. And similarly, what does God do? God rescues the nation. God raises up not Moses, but he raises up a military leader like Moses to deliver Israel. In fact, there are 14 judges. The word judge, when we think of the word judge, we think of, a guy with a black robe and a gavel. When the word that's used here for judge has more to the idea of a military leader. Somebody who had the ability to lead an army to deliver. And so God raises up through this period of time 14 different judges. Samson, Samuel, there was a woman judge, remember her name? Deborah, 14 different judges. And as God rescues them, what happens? Well, the nation has rest. God is faithful to his Sinai covenant to bless Israel in the land. If you go back to Deuteronomy and the Sinai covenant, if you repent and you draw near to me, I will bless you, I will bless you, I will bless you, I will bless you. It gives all the different blessings. But it's conditioned upon returning to God. They return to God, and God is faithful to give them rest. Now, they have rest in the land as long as who continue to live? The judge. When the judge dies, guess what happens? Rebellion, and the whole cycle, the pattern starts all over again. In fact, in chapter 2, verse 19, it summarizes this pattern. It says, when the judge died, Israel would act even more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods. In other words, this judge died, and the people act more corruptly than this previous cycle. This judge dies, and they act more corruptly than this. And so it's constantly being rooted deeper and deeper into unbelief and disloyalty. Now, I want you to note this pattern. This pattern cycles around 7 times in 400 years. There are 5 steps, and those 5 steps take place 7 times, which, if you divide it out, it's about 60 years per cycle. In other words, every 60 years, it starts over again. Second, each cycle acts as a mini Exodus intended to restore believing loyalty to Israel. What happened when God rescued Israel from Egypt? They believed God. They trusted God. They had believing loyalty. And so the mini Exodus was intended to do the same thing. God's heart was to restore believing loyalty, not just give them a nice life. However, with each cycle, believing loyalty is further diminished. This was worse than this, was worse than this, was worse than this. To the end that unbelieving loyalty finally takes root in the end of Judges, where in chapter 17 and chapter 21, at the very end of the book, it says, and everyone did right, where? In their own eyes. And at the end of the period of Judges, what we see is Israel is what scholars call, they become Canaanized. Now, what is that? What does it mean that Israel was Canaanized? Well, Israel's Canaanization is summarized 7 times. It's interesting how it's always summarized. Things are summarized in the book. 7 times in Judges. For example, 7 times it says this, then Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord by abandoning Yahweh to serve the gods of the surrounding nations. And if you look at each of those passages that I have here, it will describe what this looked like, this abandoning of the Lord. For example, instead of driving out the nations, it will say that Israel joined them. Instead of worshiping Yahweh alone, Israel also worshiped Baal. Instead of destroying Baal's altars, Israel sacrificed on them. Instead of obeying God's covenant, Israel participated in Baal's cultic practices. And instead of remaining distinct from the nations, Israel intermarried with them. In other words, what I want us to see is Israel became what? Like the nations. They were to invite the nations to become like them in the sense that they were in line with God's story. But instead, Israel left God's story and went out into the nations to form their own. As a result, they were shaped by the nation's ways and not God's ways. They worshiped the nation's lesser gods, not the Most High God. Their hearts were full of the nation's unbelief and rebellion and not believing loyalty. As a result, they were no longer distinct. They were no longer qualified to be light to the nations, and they needed rescuing just like the rest of the nations. That's what it means that Israel was Canaanized. If you think about it, we can become Canaanized too, can't we? So Paul says in Romans 12, to what? Be transformed, be not conformed to this world. Don't be Canaanized by the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Why? Because it sets the story, the framework for your life. And so the question we need to ask is, what will God do now with a Canaanized Israel? Will he throw Israel away and create a new nation? Will he just give up on his plan altogether? Let them go their way? So what's God going to do now? Well, that brings us to the second dot we want to connect today, and that is the time of the monarchy. While the period of the judges is 450 years or so, this one is about 500 years or so on the timeline. So you got about 1,000 years, this period of time that we're looking at today. And the time of the monarchy, what we see is Israel's unbelief and disloyalty during the period of the judges finally culminates in a single demand. You know what that demand is?
We want a king.
Give us a king, but not just give us a king, give us a king, what? Like the rest of the nations. Here's where it says that, 1 Samuel 8, verse 4. Give us a king to lead us like all the other nations have. Now, their request, Israel's request, was evil in Samuel's eyes. Samuel was the last judge. So he went to the Lord for guidance. God says to him, do everything they say to you, for they are not rejecting you, but they are rejecting who? Me. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me and followed other gods. There's that downward spiral that finally takes root in Judges. Notice, rejecting me, don't want me to be their king, abandon me, and all of this because they wanted what? A king like the other nations have. We want to be like the nations. Footnote. Let me ask you this. I'll put it into a question. Was Israel's desire for a king wrong? Was that wrong? We want a king. Yes and no. Notice, God had always planned to establish a human king in Israel. That's always been part of his plan. And that king was to rule as his agent over the earth. Genesis 49, it talks about that. I think that's the one that a scepter will come out of Judah. Numbers 24, Deuteronomy 17, Psalm 2, all talk about God choosing a king and establishing a king to rule his nation on his behalf. God's plan for his king was to rule Israel with God's justice and righteousness. It was to lead Israel in war against God's enemies. And it was to restore the nations back into God's family. That was the job of the king. He was to be God's agent to do God's work. That's why one of the requirements of a king was that he was constantly to be reading what? The book of the law. Yeah, God's word. Because he needed to know the word. He needed to understand the covenant. He needed to know what it meant for Israel to be part of God's plan. So what was wrong then? If God was going to choose a king, what was wrong? Well, what was wrong was not their desire for a king, but what was wrong was their demand for a king. Give us a king like the rest of the nations. Why was it wrong? Well, it was based on three things, this demand was. First, they were looking at their purpose for a king, not God's. Their purpose was to free us from who? From God. We don't want to be loyal to him. They wanted to be free, not loyal. Second, their timetable was not God's. They wanted a king now, not later. Thirdly, their resume was not God's resume. What was their resume? Height, not heart. You say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, here's the resume. 1 Samuel 9:2. Saul, who was the one that became king, was the most handsome man in all of Israel. Not only was he this GQ kind of guy, but he was head and shoulders what? Taller than anyone else in the land. This guy, when it came to the Israelites, was a giant. Now, head and shoulders taller. Why is that important to notice? What did Israel want? They wanted a king like the rest of the nations. And if you look at some of the things going on in Joshua when they're conquering the land, guess who ruled a number of the nations in the land? Giants. The Nephilim-like warrior kings. So we want a warrior king that we can trust, like the rest of the nations have. We don't want to trust you because we can't see you. And we've heard about what you did in the past, but we're not sure about that. We want something that we can trust right now, this great warrior king. We want a king like the rest of the nations. And so you have tall King Saul. And here's the question. How did it work out? Well, not really well, did it? Israel is defeated over and over in battle by the Philistines. And after 15 years of Saul's rule, 1 Samuel 15 says this. This is Samuel speaking to Saul. The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Why? Because I don't know how I got "or" in there, but because you have rejected the word of the Lord. In other words, Saul lacked a heart of believing loyalty. You don't reject the word of the Lord while you have believing loyalty. That was a sign of the condition of his heart. And as a result, God is going to take away Saul's present rule, but not only his present rule, but his future dynasty. Just as a king, Queen Elizabeth died, and now the next in the dynasty is King Charles. So Saul was to rule, and after he died, his son, who was Jonathan, was to take the rule. Why? Because the dynasty was passed on down to the next generation. And God says, because you lack a heart of believing loyalty, I'm not only going to take away your throne, but I'm going to take away your dynasty. And so then God says, okay, I'm going to be done with Saul. But before Saul is done, before he dies on the battlefield, God chooses a new king that will take Saul's place. And who is that new king? David. 1 Samuel 16 tells a story. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul? I have rejected him as king over Israel. Samuel liked Saul, and he felt bad that Saul was going to lose everything. And he says, no, I've rejected him. So go now, fill your horn with olive oil. I'm sending you to Jesse in Bethlehem, for I have chosen a king for myself among his sons. He has how many sons? Remember? 8 sons. 8 sons. And so he goes, 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, the Lord, and he brings the first son to him. And Samuel says, man, this guy has to be the Lord's anointed, the king that God is choosing for himself. And so the Lord said to Samuel, pay no attention to how tall and handsome Eliab is. Why? For I have rejected him because I don't choose as people choose. They look at the outward appearance, but I look where? At the heart. At the heart. And so he goes through the second son, and the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh, and he's at the end, he says, God tells him, I've chosen none of these. So he says, well, what are we going to do? Isn't there any more sons? And he said, yeah, I got this other son, David. He's out watching the sheep, the youngest. And so he says, well, go get him. So Jesse sent for his youngest son, David, and he was a healthy looking boy with a sparkle in his eyes. As soon as David came, the Lord told Samuel, he's the one. Get up, pour the olive oil on his head. In other words, anoint him. This is the king that I have chosen for myself. Now, what did God see in David that Samuel didn't see or no one else saw? Well, outwardly, God saw what men saw. David was a small boy, not a large man. He was an insignificant shepherd, not a mighty warrior. He was the least of 8 brothers, not the greatest among men. He was just kind of a nobody special. Nobody that you would think to look at. But inwardly, God saw what men overlook. And what did God see about David? Well, you have to go to Acts chapter 13. It tells us. God saw in David a man after God's own heart, loyal to do his will. He saw in David a heart of believing loyalty. What was needed for the king. In other words, God's choice of David was solely based on believing loyalty, nothing else. Nothing else. Why? Because he was going to entrust to David as king a great power to lead his nation, to fight his battles, and to achieve God's plan of restoring the nations. And to do that, he had to know that he could trust the man he gave great power to. And he knew that he could trust David because David's heart fully belonged to him. We see that principle, that truth, that theme in Jesus' life. We see it in the apostles' lives. We see it in Jesus' teachings, that if you want to be great, you got to be a kingdom. And those who have and are faithful to what they've been given, they will be given more. Those who aren't faithful to the power that they've been stewarded, even that will be taken away. This is part of the way we see God work throughout his story. God trusts power to those he can trust to do his will. Why? Because he sees that their hearts are fully committed to him. God will use you in the war against evil. Not because you have great talent, not because you have great gifts, not because you have great courage, for one reason. God will use you and God will use me according to the level of our believing loyalty. Saul's heart was devoid of a life of believing loyalty, and as a result, he was rejected by God. And David's heart manifests a life of believing loyalty, and as a result, what? He was chosen by God. Some examples. You say, well, how is David loyal and believing? His battle with Goliath. Again, this little shepherd boy goes and sees what's going on, And he says, I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. I'm not coming against you for no other reason. You are defaming the name of the Lord by doing what you're doing to the Lord's nation. And I'm not going to sit by and watch it. And so, as the future king, notice, he defeats God's supernatural enemies. Goliath was a descendant of the Nephilim. What's a king to do? He's to defeat God's enemies. David does that. In fact, not only that, 2 Samuel 21, 1 Chronicles 20 says that he and his men killed the remaining Nephilim. So when David's rule is done, guess where there's no more Nephilim on the earth? They finished them off. Second, David's treatment of Saul shows a life of believing loyalty. Saul is trying to kill him. He's going out after him. David's hiding in caves. And remember, several times David could have killed Saul, but he doesn't. In fact, he cuts a piece of his robe off one time, and then he repents about that he did that to the Lord's anointed. And he says, he doesn't raise a hand against Saul. Why? Because Saul is currently the Lord's anointed. And so David trusts God's covenant. David trusts God's law. I'm going to do what's right before God. Thirdly, he seeks Jerusalem, a temple for the ark. Remember, the ark was just kind of traveling all around in a tent. And David knew that God wanted to establish the capital city of the nation in Jerusalem. That's where God was going to dwell. And so he says, I dwell in a house, but the ark dwells in a tent. So what does David do? David now becomes committed to bringing the ark to Jerusalem and building a temple, a permanent temple, where God could then begin to launch his plan of causing the nations to come to Israel, to come to Jerusalem, to worship God. And so he's committed to God's plan for Israel and the nations. He isn't able to build the temple. Why? Because his hands are filled with blood. That's what Solomon will do. But David gets the ball rolling. Lastly, David's confession of disqualifying sin. Psalm 51. Remember what David did? David committed adultery with Bathsheba. In order to cover that up, he murdered her husband. And so in Psalm 51, we see David's confession of that sin. Against you and you only have I sinned and done evil. In other words, David submits to God's justice. And in fact, he says, so that whatever you do right. If you want to kill me, if you want to take the throne away from me, whatever you do, you're just in doing. David submits to God's justice. Now you say, well, how is all that believing loyalty? I thought he messed up. Well, remember what we said a couple of times ago. Believing loyalty is not about personal performance. It's not about moral perfection. It's not about having no doubts. It's not about having it all together. Believing loyalty is about continuing on in and not giving up on and holding on to two core beliefs, no matter what comes your way. First one, Yahweh is the Most High God, the creator of all things, to whom I alone bow and owe allegiance. God is God. There are no gods greater than God, and I am not God. I owe allegiance to him. Second, Yahweh's plan to rescue the world is my and mankind's only hope. Whether it's through the Exodus, whether it's through the time of the kings, whether it's through ultimately Jesus Christ, the only name by which we can be delivered. You see, David continued on in believing loyalty because in his sin, he didn't walk away from God. He didn't say, well, God is going to just throw me away anyway, so, or he says, well, I don't like what God is doing, so I'm going to go my own way. He continued to pursue God even to the point that he knew that God had the right to kill him. Job had believing loyalty. Job never gave up on God. Job fought God to the bitter end. But if you look at chapter 42, what does he say? While his friends were given cliches that didn't draw Job to God, it was looking at, well, see, I am doing it. I got to work harder and do more, then I'll be okay. Job faced God and he fought with God to the point that God says in chapter 42, what his friends were saying was wrong, and Job, your words were right. You see, he never gave up on God. He always knew that God was the Most High God and that his life was under him, and that if there's hope, it's only found in God, in Yahweh, ultimately in Jesus. Guys, it doesn't matter how bad we mess up. You know, when we mess up, the thing we want to do is walk away from God and church and kind of be alone, and maybe we'll try harder and do more, and we'll get rid of that sin or whatever, and we'll begin to feel good about ourselves, and then we'll come back to God. That's not believing loyalty. Believing loyalty comes and it tells God, and it says, God, I know you have the right to do whatever you want, but I surrender to you. It continues on, it doesn't give up on, and holds on to God and his plan for the world. Because David's believing loyalty, because David had a heart of believing loyalty, you know what God did for David? God made a covenant with David. Your descendants and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will endure forever. In other words, David's descendants alone will forever be Israel's legitimate dynasty. As long as Israel has a throne and has a kingdom, guess who's going to be sitting on it? God says, one of your sons. But we also see in Psalm 132 and Psalm 89 that the reign of each Davidic king will be blessed based on the level of their believing loyalty. In other words, if your son is loyal, he'll have a good reign. If he isn't loyal, he's going to have a short reign. In other words, while there was going to be an unconditional throne given to David, it was going to be based on a conditional reign of David's sons. Now, that's important we see. Let's look at this, the overview of the monarchy. And here we're going to put Judges, or Samuel really, through Malachi all together for us. This takes place through Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Psalms, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. You see on the bottom. That's the books of history. Saul, 1095 BC, is king. The nation suffers under Saul. The enemies oppress the nation. David is made king 1055. The nation is united under David, and the enemies are defeated. God then makes a Davidic covenant with David, and as a result, when David dies, Solomon is made king 1015 BC. The nation flourishes under Solomon, and there's peace and prosperity in the land. And what we see so far is, as goes the king's heart in terms of believing loyalty, so goes the nation. The king influences the nation, and the nation then is a reflection of the king's heart. But what we see with Solomon is that towards the end of his reign, towards the end of his life, he begins to compromise. What does he compromise? Well, Deuteronomy 17, where God says he's going to have a king, says, when I have a king, that king, while he has to read the word and know the word, he can't multiply three things. Remember what they were? Wives, weapons, and wealth. Wives, weapons, and wealth. Because if you multiply those kings, if the king multiplies those things, what's he going to begin to trust? Those things. Wives, women, and wealth. And so we see in 1 Kings 11 that, guess what? Solomon begins to multiply wives, wealth, and weapons. And as a result, he compromises. And that then affects his son, Rehoboam, who then demands that everybody really follow him in a strict, tyrannical, dictatorship-like existence. They were to do what he said. And what happens, remember? The nation rebels and civil war divides the nation in 975 BC. And it divides it into the 10 northern tribes, which was called Israel, and the 10 southern tribes called Judah. Now, the 10 northern tribes were all non-Davidic kings. There were 19 of them, and every one of them was evil. In fact, it says, and this king was evil, but his son was even more evil. And while this king was evil, his son was even more evil, and it goes on and on and on. And what does God do? Well, God raises up Elisha, Elijah, Amos, Jonah, Hosea, these prophets, and he calls to the king and he calls to the nation through them to return to God and to return to obedience to the covenant made at Sinai. They don't listen, and what happens? God says, I've had enough. And in 722 BC, God allows the Assyrian nation to come in, and they take the northern kingdom captive. They take them back to Syria, or Assyria. And guess what? They're scattered there. And we never hear anything more about them. These are the 10 lost tribes. The southern 2 tribes were called Judah. They were made up of 20 Davidic kings. Some of them were good, but the majority of them were not good. They were evil. And when they were evil, they were really evil. And as a result, God sends to the southern kingdom these prophets here, you see, and it's the same message. Return to Yahweh and be obedient to the Sinai covenant, and I will relent in judgment. I will not bring judgment down upon you. What do? Do they listen? Well, they listen a little bit longer because they have good kings that bring some reform, but ultimately, in 586 BC, God allows Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian nation to come in and destroy the nation and take them captive back to Babylon. And that's where in the book of Daniel you find Daniel, a captive in Babylon. What does this overview show us? Let's think big picture here. Here's what it shows us. God established a chosen dynasty to rule over his special nation with a heart of believing loyalty. Why? Well, God had a plan from the very beginning, a plan that began when those 3 uprisings took place, a plan that brought about bringing a nation out of Abraham. And that plan was to create a new nation that would be faithful to God. And as a result, he would use them to restore the rebellious nations that he had divorced that were now being ruled over by the rebellious angelic sons, the lesser gods. How was he going to do that? Well, God's strategy. Through faithful Israel, God would use them to be a light to the nations by being distinct from the nations, reflecting God as the law reflects God, and as they obeyed the law, they would reflect God to the nations, and that would invite the nations back to God, and all this was given to them at the covenant in Sinai. But what happened? Well, Israel falters. They're failed soldiers. God's special nation and chosen dynasty ultimately become Canaanized through their unbelief and disloyalty to the point that God has had enough. And so what does God do? Well, like the Babel uprising in chapter 11 of Genesis, God scatters Israel into the nations. Chapter 11, he scatters his human family into the nations, or into the world, and they become the nations. But he not only scatters Israel into the nations, like the rebellious nations, God divorces Israel from himself. Jeremiah 3, verse 8, Judah also saw that I gave wayward Israel her divorce papers. The southern kingdom saw this, that he gave divorce papers to the northern kingdom, and sent her away because of her adulterous worship of other gods. Again, why? Because no believing loyalty. That was the Assyrian captivity in 722. And even after her unfaithful sister Judah had seen this, even though the southern kingdom saw what God did to the northern kingdom, she was still not afraid, and she too went and gave herself like a prostitute to other gods until God did what? Okay, here's your divorce papers. The Babylon captivity in 586 BC. In other words, as we come to the end of the Old Testament, and this is important now, guys, this is what I want us to see. God's plan to restore the nations and return his human family to himself seems to have what? Failed. Everything God does, the human element of it, doesn't remain faithful to do what God has asked them to do. And so as we come to the end of the Old Testament, it feels like the plan for God to have a family, a human family, by restoring the divorced nations, and now he's going to even have to restore Israel back to himself, it's failed. The nations are still divorced from him. The cosmic enemies are still ruling the nations. The light has gone out in Israel, and Israel is now scattered and divorced from God. The cosmic war certainly seems to be going in the wrong direction, doesn't it? That's not what you would expect from a sovereign and good God. Who like that could stop it and win at any moment? So, as we come to the Old Testament, the question is there hope? Is there hope? Well, scattered throughout the Old Testament, there are little signs of hope, little glimmers of hope, little secrets of hope that the prophets are talking about. But if we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, right after the first uprising, the fall, God makes a promise. And it has to do that he would win with his family the cosmic war. What was it? Genesis 3:15. I will cause hostility between you, the serpent, and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. What's he saying? Well, in this cosmic war, the woman's offspring is going to deal the serpent and his followers ultimately a lethal blow. He's going to strike him in the head. But it won't be without bloodshed. And that's because the serpent and his family will strike his heel. It will be a blow, but it will be non-lethal. God and his family, in other words, will win the war, but not without suffering and bloodshed. Now this ties us to what we saw in 2 Timothy 2:3, where Paul says to you and me as followers of Jesus, share in the suffering as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. You know what that's telling us? That we have been saved not just to keep our nose clean and wait to go to heaven when we die and have a nice life in between. God has called us. He's delivered us from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his Son. And he's adopted us as sons, and he's given us a task. And what is the task? Do the Father's business. And what is the Father's business? Cosmic war. What I want you to see is being a good soldier in the cosmic war isn't going to be easy for any of us. It promises discomfort and suffering. Even though we're going to win, there is going to be discomfort and suffering. It requires a serious wartime mindset, therefore. In fact, Paul says in 2 Timothy, where he says, be good soldiers, he says, hey, we can't be like civilians who are just kind of doing this. We got to have a soldier, a wartime mindset. Third, it's to be fought with believing loyalty. And fourth, it's possible to falter and fail. That's what we learn about the cosmic war and God's soldier sons who are called to be about that war. That leaves us with three questions before we close. First one is this. If God is going to win, how will God keep his promise of victory in the face of the apparent failure of his plan? And guys, you think it's dark now at the end of the Old Testament? It's going to even get a lot darker. It's going to seem like God has lost. In fact, that's what the other side thought. Second question we need to ask. Where do we fit into God's plan in the cosmic war as his adopted sons called to be about our Father's business? Are we to, like Israel, go around lopping off people's heads, killing giants with swords and guns and knives? Is that what the battle looks like for us today? What does the battle look like? How is it to be fought today? How do we do our Father's business? Third question. What do we do when we falter in the battle and fail as a soldier because of a heart of unbelief and disloyalty? What do we do? Those are three really important, heavy questions that need to be answered. And so we're going to answer them from the New Testament, but we're not going to look at that until next time. And so next time, October 8th, continuing what on earth God is doing, we're going to look at a session called There's More to Jesus Than the Cross. There's more to Jesus than him simply dying on the cross for our sins so that we can go to heaven when we die. And what we're going to see is that's true, but it's much bigger and more richer than that. And it ties the whole Bible together from Genesis to Revelation. And it's about God restoring his world through something we would have never dreamed possible. Something that was so unthought of. Something that so caught the other side by surprise that Paul says, if they knew what it was, they wouldn't have done it. We'll look at that next time. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for our time. Thank you for your word and the many stories in it that form the one story that really forms the framework for our story. Teach us to live within your story as your sons, adopted into your family to do your business. Grow in us believing loyalty that allows us to be courageous and clear in how to fight the battle, that we might please you as your sons. In Christ's name, amen.